A rare moment of unity on Capitol Hill with two lawmakers from opposite sides of the aisle introducing a bill to protect roughly 1.3 million Americans under conservatorships. Now, this all came about from pop icon Britney Spears, who is locked in a very public family feud over control of her life and her fortune. South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace is one of the sponsors of that measure. She joins us now. So, Congresswoman, tell us about the FREE Act.
Right, and thank you, Arthel, for having me on this afternoon. The FREE Act, well, first of all, I want to thank Britney Spears. It took a lot of courage for her to come forward in a very public way as a celebrity and public figure, detailing the abuses of her conservatorship just last month in June. And her situation is a total nightmare. And if it can happen to her, of all people, then it can happen to anyone. And what this piece of legislation would do would allow someone like Britney, who's in a conservatorship, to petition a judge, petition the court for an independent or public guardian, someone that could oversee the conservatorship who doesn't have a conflict of interest, financial or otherwise. And that's really at the crux of this. And there are 1.3 million people in conservatorships across the country today.
Now, if Britney Spears had an attorney or attorneys who she claims either intentionally or inadvertently did not explain her rights within the conservatorship to her, how could a new law alert unknown Americans, non-celebrities, if you will, if their rights under conservatorships are being violated? I mean, most people aren't aware of all their legal protections. So how do you make them aware should this become law?
Right. Another disturbing detail that she has spoken out about, and I believe, looking at some of her comments, she's going to continue to detail more of the abuses that she's had in conservatorship. This is not a perfect bill. It's not everything. It does include the kitchen sink. Congressman Chris and I want to make sure we can get a good start to reforming the conservatorship process, because there are people, we've heard from people all across the country that have been abused within the system, and we want to allow more transparency and accountability, and this bill will do that. There's also a funding mechanism of grant money that is out there that we can utilize to help provide oversight from caseworkers, to allow caseworkers to ensure abuses are not happening. And it's really important that individuals who are in these conservatorships know that they do have the right, if this bill passes, and is signed into law, that they will have the right to petition a court to have someone overseeing their life and their finances for someone who doesn't have a financial advantage. And if you listen to Britney Spears, a lot of people are making a lot of money off of her. And this is an individual, she's been working every year since she was in this conservatorship. And as a mom, one of the things I was really disturbed by is they're forcing her on birth control and IUD to not allow her to have kids. I mean, it's just really crazy what's going on. These are things that happen in communist China, not the United States of America. And I think this is a really good bipartisan first step to seeing reform.
Yeah, no, the Britney Spears case and what she says happened to her, it's really just gross. There's no other way to describe it. And I understand what you're saying, Congresswoman, that no bill is, perfect, but I do applaud your efforts. And I want to know, so would the FREE Act make it easier for, again, non-celebrity Americans to get out of conservatorships?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it would allow them to have someone who's independent, a public guardian, oversee their conservatorship. And I think that's a good first step in allowing these people to have someone who has no conflict of interest, who will not keep them in a conservatorship should they be adjudicated or believe they should be adjudicated to get out of it. I think that's really important as well.
Okay, so that would be the caseworker you referenced, someone like that.
Yes.
Okay, got it, got it. All right, well, thank you, South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace, for your work on this very important law. We hope it becomes law. Thank you very much.
I hope so too, thank you.
We'll be right back.